Good evening, everybody. For the past 8 years, the Streicker Center has been a place of celebration of all things Jewish, of our history, our tradition, our food, our text, our beliefs, our music, our passions. Since October 7th, however, as we were stunned by Hamas attack and the war in Gaza, by the appearances of swastikas on public buildings, and the sound of hate speech echoing across the country, our focus has shifted. And to a roster of events about food, films, books, and American politics, we have added programs that speaks to concerns that we have never imagined would be so pressing. So over the coming weeks, we invite you to gain new insight into what's going on in Israel with just announced program with Thomas Friedman, and Israeli journalist Itai Engel, who recently embedded with IDF troops in Gaza, among many other programs we hope you'll come back for. Tonight, Rabbi David Wolpe returns to the Streicker Center by telling the story of a community that has spent thousands of years trying to quell the hate, only to see it rise once more in different forms with different rationales. David Wolpe, of course, is the former rabbi of Los Angeles Sinai Temple. He was named one of the most influential Jews in the world by Jerusalem Post. He is a writer of 8 books, a popular teacher and speaker, a visiting scholar at Harvard who recently made national news when he resigned from Harvard Antisemitism Advisory Committee after the congressional testimony of President Claudine Gay. Before we welcome him, I would like to thank our sponsor for tonight, William Greenberg Desserts. I know why people are laughing, it's tasty. But really seriously, if this is the second program they're sponsoring this semester, and it really allows us to offer such important program for the community at no charge. So we'd like to thank them for doing this. Also, on your way out tonight, in addition to getting this brochure, you'll also get a little treat from William Greenberg. So next time you happen to go to William Greenberg Dessert, just walk in and tell them that Streicker sent you, okay? I appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, on a more serious note, please welcome Rabbi David Wolpe.
So first I want to thank Gadi. You may not know this, but Gadi and I have a partnership that goes way back to when he was in Los Angeles, and I have always been in awe of his ability to create programs throughout the Jewish world that are bigger than any programs throughout the Jewish world other than Gadi's, and also to supply dessert. And thank you to William Greenberg Desserts. So I want to start from a story that is an old Jewish story that goes back to Russia about 2 men who are walking by a church, and they're lamenting their poverty, and they're talking about how hard it is to feed their families. And on the church it says, come in, convert, get 50 rubles. So one of them says to the other, he says, you know what? I'm going to do it. So the other one goes, really? He says, yeah, I'm going to do it. He goes into the church. He comes out a little while later, and his friend goes, so did you do it? He said, yeah, I did. He said, did they give you the 50 rubles? He goes, that's all you Jews think about is money. It tells us something important about anti-Semitism. That very story, it's a distorted but a really powerful filter through which people see the world. And it doesn't matter how big Chinese banks get or Middle Eastern money is, it's the Jews that control the banks. It doesn't matter that Bush and Cheney and Condoleezza Rice aren't Jewish, it was Wolfowitz that put us in Iraq. How did we get here? How did that happen that it became impossible for people to see Jews the same way they see other people, and to see them in a way that is almost always to their detriment, even sometimes when they are Jewish themselves? I want to give you 5 separate aspects of anti-Semitism because all of them are significant and all of them play in to this ancient hatred that has, as we know, not gone away. First of all, anti-Semitism begins in fear of the other. This is not a feature unique to the Jewish community. This is a feature that is built in to the human being. When you see a new kid come into class, when you see a new family move in, when you see someone who doesn't look like you, act like you, talk like you, there is an almost automatic defensive and distant reaction, and the Jew was the original champion of diversity. We weren't like the people around us. Moreover, even worse, we didn't want to be like the people around us. We ate different foods. We lived in separate neighborhoods. We interacted, but still came home to our own communities. And this alone, already from the beginning of the Jewish people, was something that the world resented. You see it in the Bible. When in Egypt they say, look, they're going to become too numerous for us, i.e., there is a group among us that's not like us, and we don't like it. And throughout Jewish history, even when Jews sought not to be different, they were seen as different. It didn't matter what you did. You could change your name and chop your nose. You were still a Jew. And so the dislike of the unlike was one of the original sources of anti-Semitism and still persists as a feature of anti-Semitism today. They're just not like us. In Rome, we were the one religious group that didn't want a statue of the emperor in our temple. So what do you do with a group that is not like you? Well, if they can be ignored, if they're negligible, if they're unimportant, then maybe you can tolerate them. But Jews were both elevated and betrayed by their own abilities. Jews tended to rise again and again and again in whatever society they found themselves. I know that we think of Jews as being accomplished in the modern world, but you know, in medieval times, Jews composed an absurd, almost half of the number of doctors in various countries. And in fact, the story goes that when Francis I was ailing and a captive of Charles V of the Holy Roman Emperor, he said, I only want a Jewish doctor. And they brought him a doctor, and he said, just to test his bona fides, he said to him, aren't you tired of waiting for the Messiah to come? And the doctor said, oh, I'm a converso, I've been a baptized Christian for most of my life. And he said, go away, I don't want you, I want a real Jew. Now you realize how insane that is. But this idea, this reality, this recognition that 5% of 20,000 people living in Marseille in the 14th century were Jews, but half of them were doctors. That 0.2% of the world's populations have won almost a quarter of the Nobel Prizes, which is something we love to say again and again, but it's really inexplicable that 99.8% of the world gets the other 3/4, and 0.2% gets 1/4. And you can imagine that if you already don't like someone, their doing well doesn't help. And in fact, there is a way in which anti-Semitism is different from other hatreds because the Jews are seen as both subhuman and superhuman. They are vermin who control the world. That was how the Nazis spoke of them. And the way that that happens is by seeing that, in fact, in whatever society they find themselves, they start to rise. If you ask me, by the way, why that is, and this is the subject of another discussion, I don't think that it's an issue of intrinsic abilities. I think it's culture. The Jews, after all, were the people of the book, of the word. We had a portable culture, a tradition of argument and study. And when you take that and you apply it to an information economy, when something relies on knowledge, on learning, we're in our element. And so again and again and again, when it was a question of international trade or of keeping things in your head, of being able to learn and to retain information and to be adroit with ideas, we're the people of the book. But it wasn't only that we were seen as other and seen as able. It was that anti-Semitism was a very effective, is a very effective political movement. In the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, all of a sudden people discovered that by hating Jews, you can draw disparate groups together. If you think of the Nazi Axis, there were a lot of countries that did not necessarily have causes in common, but one thing they had in common: they could blame their ills on the Jews. And it worked. Because, as you know, mutual enmity is the greatest glue in the world. If the two of us hate the same person, we feel close. And that's why you get signs like Queers for Hamas. It's oxymoronic. It's also moronic. But why do you get signs like Queers for Hamas when, after all, look, they're not stupid. They know that Hamas has no tolerance for homosexuality. They know that if they lived there, they would be persecuted or killed. They know that, but you create political alliances that way. What do all the 21 Arab nations have in common over the past 50 years? They fight with each other all the time, but they could all hate Israel. And it draws them all together. And in order to be the victim of this, you have to be two things that the Jews are. You have to be small enough that you can persecute them with relative impunity, right? You don't want to be too prejudiced against somebody that can strike back too hard. But the Jews were negligible. But they have to be significant enough that you can make a rallying cause around them. And the Jews serve both purposes. We are small enough to persecute and important enough to persecute. Just our luck. But it's true. And so you get these alliances throughout history that draw different groups together because they are against the Jews, which explains also some crazy things that we don't understand on any rational level. Like, why would Nazis divert essential war materials to kill more Jews? But the point was, that was exactly what made the whole machine go. That was what they all shared in common. That was the great cause. So it was done. Now this, all of it, would be enough. But as you may know, and it's painful to acknowledge, but we're all grown-ups here, it was given religious and rhetorical rocket fuel by Christianity. After all, Jesus was a part of the Jewish people. And therefore, Jesus' disciples were the children, the younger brother, the sibling of the Jewish people. And at least two things explain the deep psychological anger and hatred of Christianity towards Judaism throughout many generations. It was not only the comment in the New Testament that the Jews killed Jesus. It was that this is a family quarrel. And unfortunately, then it got sanctified by being in a biblical book forever and ever and ever. And need I tell you, in a post-Freudian age, what it is when your father rejects you. Here was Christianity turning to the parent religion, to Judaism, and saying, we are the real continuation. And the Jews said, no, you're not. No, you're not. You believe one of our people was God. He's not God. And by the way, if you are a Jew in the time of Jesus and God walks among you and you don't recognize or acknowledge him as God, there are only two explanations. One is, it's not very godlike. That's the Jewish explanation. The other is, you're either blind or wicked. What else could be? And that same idea that Jews are both subhuman and superhuman is explained by the English scholar Hyman Maccabee as only superhumans can kill a god. So the Christian hatred of the Jews and the insistence that the Jews eventually come to recognize the truth of Christianity has been a powerful and sustaining force of anti-Semitism for a very, very, very long time. And although we live in a very different world, we should not ignore, if we're trying to understand where anti-Semitism comes from, the damage that was done over the generations from this beginning. Because after all, for a long time, Jews lived in a Christian world that periodically persecuted and forcefully converted in all sorts of ways. You know, some Jews unknowingly call the Western Wall the Wailing Wall. Do you know why it's called the Wailing Wall? Because when Christians controlled Jerusalem, they would allow Jews to go to the Old City one day a year, on Tisha B'Av, the day that the temple was destroyed. And the point of allowing them was to show this is what happens to a people that rejects God, and Jews would walk in front of the wall and they would cry. So it was the Wailing Wall. But this kind of systematic degradation was a big part of what happened in the 20th century. As the scholar Eliezer Berkowitz said powerfully, it's true that the Nazis were not Christians. It is also true that they were all the children of Christians. I want to say, having said this, and I don't take back a word of it, that one of the great miracles and changes of the latter half of the 20th and the 21st century has been the shift in the Christian world. And now some of the Jews' very, very best friends and allies are Christians, which would have been unthinkable to our ancestors. We should recognize and be grateful for that, but also aware that there is a very long history here. And it now nourishes other kinds of anti-Semitisms because a lot of those tropes, like the protocols of the elders of Zion, have found their way into the Muslim world. And even though the protocols of the elders of Zion is a Russian forgery about how Jews control the world, you can find it now all throughout the Middle East. So these tropes get recycled again and again and again because anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, which makes it different from other hatreds. It's always about how the Jews manage to do as a group this, that, or the other. And this also lets us understand that there are, this is my own way of putting it, I don't think that it's exactly, I hope you'll understand the way I'm saying it, but in some ways, there are two different kinds of anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. On the right, there is from a personal, visceral hatred of Jewish people. That is, as soon as you know someone is Jewish, you feel this deep antipathy that was characteristic of neo-Nazis, the Klan, and so on. On the left, there is a hatred of the Jew. That is an ideological construct. And one of the remarkable things about anti-Semitism is that you can hate Jews for anything. You can hate them because they're communists or because they're capitalists. You can hate them because they're weak and stateless or because they're strong and they have a state. You can hate them because they wander and they try to assimilate and they try to look like everybody else, or because they're different and they wear these long black coats and they look weird. Whatever you want to hate, you can find something in the Jew that will allow you to hate because, as I have said, it serves so many other deep psychological needs for individuals and for society. And then finally, in the catalog, as though that weren't enough, Jews committed the unforgivable act of introducing conscience to the world, certainly to the Western world. If you look at the Ten Commandments, you know the difference between the Ten Commandments and the laws that preceded it is for most of human history up to Sinai, what the gods cared about was how you treated them. If you made a good offering, the gods favored you. Look at the Greek myths. The god loves this one and doesn't love that one, so the god favors that one and they win. The Ten Commandments said God cares about how you treat each other. It's not just about how you treat God. It's how you treat the person next to you. And that call to conscience also means, sorry about this, but it's true, a call to sin and guilt. And as Maurice Samuel said, no one likes their alarm clock. And the Jews were an alarm clock. By the way, I hate to invoke this person as an authority on anything, but you know who said the Jews introduced conscience to the world? Hitler. And I want to kill the conscience. That idea that we in fact said this is good and this is bad, and we insisted on it, and we held on to that moral code with our teeth, and we would not let go, and we judged, that the world couldn't forgive. It's why Jews are in the forefront of every movement. You name it. Communists, reformers, social democrats, avatars of social justice, whatever it is, there are always Jews in the forefront. In the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, irony of ironies. Do you know that of Mandela's 12 co-defendants, 5 of them were Jewish, even though Jews were less than 1% of the population? Because that conscience doesn't let us go. And so we restrained the worst impulses that then paradoxically got directed against ourselves. So all of this created this crazy and irrational and powerful hatred, so that you would get things that people would say about the Jews that you make no sense, like they bake Christian children's blood into their matzah and their wine? Do you know that in certain communities during the Middle Ages on Passover, the rabbi said you should not drink red wine, only white wine, to prove that we weren't adding blood to it? Now, how insane is that? Because we, as a people that generally tends to favor, I hope, rationality, sometimes we don't give enough credit to how crazed and crazy beliefs about us can be. After all, it's just us. How could you believe that about us? How many jokes have we made to each other about, I didn't know that Jews controlled it, I missed that meeting? Because it seems so absurd, but do you know how many people believe it? Really believe it. And even people who don't believe it, or entirely believe it, still it hovers in sort of the subterranean layers of their consciousness. Let me tell you a story that was told to me by Dara Horn, who is going to be one of the speakers in the Antisemitism series, which she tells in the series, but I'm going to anticipate her by telling it because it fits so beautifully with this. She was speaking at a university, and one of the deans got up and said, "How do I explain Jewish power to my students?" And she said, "What do you mean, Jewish power?" He said, "Well, you know, these people who are so wealthy that are pushing the universities around by withholding donations or giving money or so on." And she said, "Let me explain something to you." I'm paraphrasing. She said, "What you're talking about are what donors do. Donors give money when they like something, and they take money away when they don't. It doesn't matter what the cause or the institution is, that's what donors do. What makes this Jewish?" But you see, what made it Jewish was that he had taken that and layered it already on an image of Jewish ubiquitous power that made it about Jews. Even though you can see, like other ethnic groups that predominate in other fields, but if Jews are in this area or that area, they are isolated, targeted, and made subject to invidious stereotypes. And that's why Jewish history has more massacres than you can remember. I mean, when you talk to a Jew about anti-Semitism, they mention the pogroms, maybe they mention the Inquisition. And they certainly mention the Holocaust. But who remembers in 1066 when 4,000 Jews were killed in Granada by a Muslim mob? Or the destruction of the Rhineland communities where 2,000 Jews in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were all slaughtered? And I could go through Jewish history and do this again and again and again and again. We were shocked by what Hamas did in part because we aren't used to it anymore. But anymore, we were. It wasn't, in fact, anomalous to have Jewish communities attacked and to have Jews killed. There were times, obviously, when we lived in good relations with the surrounding communities, and there were people who were tremendous avatars of goodwill, but Jews always had to wait in anticipation of the next blow. We never knew. We were always in a state of anxiety and of worry and of fear. And it didn't matter what happened. It didn't matter whether we were in medieval times or in Enlightenment times, as Herzl found out at the Dreyfus trial. There was always that stereotype that was waiting to activate and to attack. So, where are we now? I want to make two general comments about our current situation, which, unfortunately for Jews, is less unprecedented than people who don't know Jewish history well might think. First of all, I want to talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. A lot of ink has been spilled about whether they are the same thing. And a lot of people have had their rhetorical fists up to prove whether they are or they aren't. I want to tell you that anti-Zionism is not identical to anti-Semitism. Can you believe that Jews shouldn't have a state and still not hate Jews? Absolutely, it's possible. You could. But the overlap in the Venn diagram is so great that it is fair to jump to that conclusion first and to allow it to be disproved. Because if you believe that there should be 50 Muslim states, but not a single Jewish one, if you believe that Germany, after causing 2 world wars, that Syria, after killing hundreds of thousands of its own people, that Sudan, after sending 7 million people into exile, that the Congo, after killing thousands upon thousands upon thousands, probably tens of thousands of its own people, and using child soldiers and putting them in the front ranks, which Iran also did, that all those nations should still obviously continue to exist, but Israel shouldn't exist anymore, then it's really hard for me to understand that your conclusion is based on dispassionate analysis. I have to suspect that something more is underneath it, and the reason I suspect is not just what I just said, that it's weird that the only nation that is singled out for this kind of opprobrium is Israel, but because I know everything that came before. If Jews didn't have a millennial history of hatred and then all of a sudden our state didn't deserve to exist, I would say, that's curious. I wonder why you think this state doesn't. But when I know that in both the Muslim and the Christian world, to different degrees at different times in different ways, and even post-Enlightenment, there has been this tremendous drumbeat of prejudice and hatred against Jews, and then you say the Jewish state is the one that shouldn't exist. I really have to doubt the integrity of your conclusion. And so are they the same? No, they aren't the same. But there's an awful lot of overlap. And then the other question that we have to ask is, what about Jews in America? When I was a young rabbi, I remember thinking, since my father was a rabbi for most of his career in Philadelphia, I remember thinking, anti-Semitism was a central feature of my father's rabbinate, but won't be of mine. And in fact, for a good maybe 20 years, was right about that. But we are in an age of the return of the repressed, and that is no longer true, and this is the only time in my memory that American Jews have felt as uneasy, as frightened, as uncomfortable, as scared sometimes, as they do. I saw today a video that you may see, I don't know if it's going online, if it'll go viral, it may, from Harvard, where I am this year, of the workers at Harvard, the maintenance staff and so on, clearing the notice boards. And what they were doing basically was taking down all the pictures of the hostages and erasing them. And there was something so powerfully symbolic about seeing that image, that here was the symbol of Jews' suffering being erased, that I couldn't help but feel a twinge of what I am sure my great-great-great-great-grandparents felt almost every day of their lives. Having said that, I also want to say, and I think it's important to say, why I believe America is different. Because I don't think that America is analogous to other places for the following reason. It's not that Americans are nicer people than other people, right? People are people are people. And it isn't that we have a constitution, because other places have constitutions and they mean nothing. But for most of Jewish history, we were the other identifiable group. There were Frenchmen and Jews. There were Russians and Jews, Germans and Jews. There are not Americans and Jews, because there's no category Americans. America is composed of a melange, a salad, a mosaic of different groups. And so there are different prejudices that exist in America. And anti-Semitism is one of them. It is not the only one. And in fact, weirdly, at the same time as anti-Semitism is wildly on the rise, when you ask what is the most admired religious group in America, it turns out to be Jews. Some of that may be anti-Semitism too, but nonetheless. And so what I would say is Jews face tremendous challenges in America. But we are safer here than we have been in any country at any time in all of our history. And sometimes, as Abba Eban said, Jews like their clouds without silver linings. We only want to see the bad stuff. But even, I'll tell you, at Harvard, that now famous bastion of everyone is an anti-Semite, I and lots of other people walk around with a kippah, and no one has ever said anything to me, even before they knew who I was, and now even after they know who I am. And that's true for other students too. Now, that doesn't mean that there will never be an incident, a problem, prejudice. It doesn't mean that Jews feel safe there. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work to do. It doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism there. But I really think it is important for the Jewish community to see multiple sides of this question, including the side where if you brought my great-great-great-great-grandfather, even though I don't know him or where he lived or who he was, but I know that if you brought him to this place right now, he would say, I can't believe the incredible good fortune of the Jews that I'm looking at in this audience. We have come a very long way. And the only way you don't know that is if you don't study Jewish history. So it is important that we remember that we are way too experienced to get hysterical, but at the same time, we are too wise to be naive. Anti-Semitism is back. I don't know that it ever really went away, but it is back. And part of the difficulty is that none of us, and I want to emphasize this, none of us knows effectively how to fight it. We try lots of different things, and some of them seem to work on this or that, but there is no perfect cure for something that has been around for thousands of years. So we try to make alliances with different groups, but sometimes the groups that we've made alliances with don't make alliances back. It's very difficult. But I will make at least a couple of suggestions because I don't want to just leave you with these are all the reasons that they hate us and thank you and good night. Although that has its own entertainment value in a peculiarly weird and self-flagellating Jewish way. First of all, we Jews are much better at identifying enemies than we are at embracing friends. We have a lot of friends. A lot of friends. Let me tell you a story. I was riding along in an Uber, and my phone rang, and it was Van Jones from CNN. I didn't know Van Jones. And he said to me, I was given your name by so-and-so. I want to put together a service for blacks and Jews because you were there for us and we want to be there for you. So together with Van Jones and Sheryl Sandberg, we invited 50 Jewish leaders and 50 black leaders to a Zoom service where we all got on the service, and T.D. Jakes, who is the most prominent black preacher in America, I think, prayed for the Jewish people. I had tears in my eyes, and so did every other person on that Zoom that I spoke to from the Jewish community. And what it said to me was, now remember, most people who are friendly to you won't reach out. For every person who reaches out, there are 100, 1,000 people who feel similarly, but they're not going to call you, right? But what it said to me is, we don't recognize that other people see what is happening too and care about it. And so the first thing that we have to do to combat anti-Semitism is never say everybody hates us. Don't say it. It's not true. And it is an insult to all those people who aren't Jewish who are well-meaning towards us. Don't allow yourself to be captured by that easy, oh, everybody hates us. And also, when you see any public figure who says something positive about Israel, about Jews, thank them. I've written a lot of emails to people I don't know just saying, I saw you say this and I want you to know the Jewish community really appreciates your saying that. People like to be seen and acknowledged and thanked for doing good things, and we don't do that nearly enough. Second, listen. One of the problems, I mean, there are lots, but one of the problems that we have in regard to the debate about Israel is we don't want to listen to the people who disagree with us. We just want to tell them why they're wrong. Now, believe me, I want to tell them why they're wrong at least as badly as you do. But I know that I have never changed my mind by somebody coming up to me and yelling at me about why I'm wrong. And the only way, especially if it is someone close to you, the only way that you're going to start to open the kind of dialogue that might change minds is if you really listen. Joseph Epstein, my friend who's a wonderful writer and essayist, he said, Jews don't listen, they wait. And when he said that, I knew exactly what he meant, because how often have I been listening to someone speak and I'm just waiting for them to finish so I can tell them what they should think, right? Just, come on, put the period at the end of the sentence so I can actually tell you what you should think. But we have to be able to listen to engage people in a dialogue as opposed to a lecture. Lectures are for op-eds and pundits and lectures. But if you really want to change minds, you have to be able to understand why the other person has arrived at the conclusion they have. And by the way, the best way to do that is ask. Why do you believe that? What brought you to that? What have you read that told you about that? Why do you think this? It's amazing. First of all, you can learn something. But second of all, you can actually open a dialogue because most people really want to be heard. And then third. Third is, there have been throughout history two reactions overall to anti-Semitism in the Jewish community. One has been to disappear. That is, I'm going to be quiet. it's going to go away, I'm going to be silent, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. The other is to be vocal, to be Jewish, to be proud, to be identified. In other words, to be who we are. We don't increase respect for ourselves by pretending we're not who we are. That's not the solution. So I really think that even though there is no solution to anti-Semitism, there are practical, workable reactions that the Jewish community can and should adopt. Now, having said all of this, one of the things that October 7th has taught all of us, and I first heard it in the name of Dorit Rabanian, the Israeli novelist. She said, "I used to think I was Israeli. Now I realize I'm Jewish." October 7th has tied the entire Jewish world together. We all know now that we are all in the same boat, that none of us are exempt, that we are, sometimes whether we like it or not, one people. But there's something beautiful and biblical about that. You know, we started off on a journey. That's what God said to Abraham and Sarah. Actually, even more beautifully, he only said it to Abraham. God only said it to Abraham, but Abraham heard it as Abraham and Sarah, because they went together. And that's how we should be. We should be one people, understanding that we face something that is both irrational, but also in certain ways compatible. And you can have 1,000 different opinions about Israel. You can hate the government or love the government. You can hate the settlers or love the settlers. Jews disagree with each other. But Israel is integral in one way or another to what it means to be a Jew, and we should never let anyone, including other Jews, take that away from us. So let me close with a story that I always used to love to tell, but boy, since October 7th, I tell it every chance I get. And this is a chance. So as you may know, in the Jewish tradition, we don't talk a lot about the afterlife. We talk about it some. We talk about it more than most Jews think, but we don't talk about it that much. And we do have a word, actually, for heaven or paradise. We call it Gan Eden, right? The Garden of Eden. Or Olam Haba, the world to come. And we have a word for hell, which many of you know, Gehenna. What you may not know is that Gehenna is a real place. The Valley of Hinnom is outside the walls of Jerusalem. And the reason that it is identified with hell in the Jewish tradition is that in ancient times, that's where Canaanites sacrificed children. We've dug up the altars. And you can imagine that for our ancestors, that was hell. So about 50 years ago, some Israeli archaeologists were excavating in Gehenna. And there, they came upon the oldest bit of Torah that exists in the world. From the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, in the home of a family that lived right there, they found 2 rolled-up silver amulets. And they spent about a year unrolling them without doing any damage to their parts. And you can still see them in the Israel Museum. So when you go there, you can go and see the oldest bit of Torah, more than 500-600 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this, when they unrolled it, was what it said. Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Yair Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you. May God's countenance shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God be with you and give you peace. Which means that the oldest bit of Torah in the world is a blessing of peace that was snatched from hell. That's what we've done for thousands of years. I don't know how, but I have every faith that we will do it again. Thank you.